We are in Exodus chapter 6 this morning. Exodus chapter 6. And there's a reason why Dustin avoided this. Pawned it off to me to do this morning. How many of you, now be honest with me now, how many of you, when you get to a chapter like chapter 6 in Exodus where it's a genealogy, be honest now, just kind of skip over it? I'm going to actually ask for a show of hands. So that either means you really do read through the genealogies, which I find that hard to believe. But I'll give some of you maybe do. Or you skip it, or you're just afraid to say you skip over it. So, either you do really read them, which I find that hard to believe, or you just skip over them and you're afraid to say you skip over them, or you skip over it and you raised your hand this morning. So, obviously, I'm teasing a little bit, but that's the tendency sometimes, The joke about the book of Numbers is, do you really want to have to read through that, because it's a drudge in some respects, And the genealogies can kind of be that way, where oftentimes we just sort of go, a bunch of names I can't pronounce, move on. We don't see much value in it. We wonder what the value is in it. But God put it there for a reason. Put it there for our benefit. So the real question we struggle with is, what's the benefit of it? And I came up with a number of things that maybe kind of help us shape why these genealogies are important. And some of them are going to apply today, not all of them. But one of the things these genealogies do is they help us establish the historicity of people and events in the Bible. That's clearly what it's for, to help us understand the historicity of the events and the people in the Bible. It tells us who they are, where they came from, and that can be important. They reveal God's promise-keeping and His covenant-keeping to us. That's one that we're going to actually see today. The Abrahamic covenant passed down through generations. The genealogies are important because it tells us who's part of Abraham's line. They establish lines of succession of authority. We're going to see that when it comes to the priests. That was critical. In fact, even today, in Israel, there are those who believe that there will be another temple built and they will reinstitute the sacrifices. And they have genealogies to be able to identify who can qualify even today as a priest to offer sacrifices if they ever get to that point. They're critical. And so that's another reason we're going to see that in our passage today. They confirm the fulfillment of prophecy. Abraham and the Davidic prophecies are fulfilled in Christ. The genealogies become important for that. They also show how God's redemptive plan has always included not just Jews, but Gentiles. And the reason for that is because Gentiles are included in the genealogies. In fact, Tamar, Rahab, we have Ruth, we have Bathsheba. They're all in Christ's lineage leading to the Messiah, and they're Gentiles, which tells us that Gentiles are a part of God's plan. And so you see, there's a lot of reasons why God puts these genealogies in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. Today specifically, we're in Exodus chapter 6, and I think we're going to see at least a few of these purposes. We're going to see how it provides a way to determine who was qualified to serve as priests and assistants to the priest when they finally entered the land and have to now begin enacting the law, and even through their wilderness journey. Another thing we're going to see this morning is that this genealogy confirms the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. And then lastly, we're going to see how it established Moses and Aaron's authority to lead God's people out of Egypt, in part because their leadership was challenged by somebody who happens to be in this genealogy. So let's go ahead and break this down. It's going to be a little more challenging this morning for me to get through the names and pronounce them properly. But it's also going to be a little more challenging to make practical application. And that is one of the big challenges with genealogies. How do you practically apply the genealogies? Is there really some intent? And Dustin and I talked about this on Friday morning. The majority of the times I think when you get into the text, there's almost always something practical in that text that God intends. But sometimes the intent is to inform and to shape how we maybe think or what we understand. And the intent of that particular passage isn't necessarily that we have some takeaway behavior that we can modify or change as a result. Again, much of the scriptures is that way. It's to help us to change our thinking and our behavior. But there's some that's more just informative. It's to help us understand. And so a passage like this is more probably about shaping our understanding and thinking. But there may be a couple of things here that we can take away from this. So let's go ahead and break this down. One purpose of this genealogy this morning was to provide a way to determine who was qualified to serve as priests and then priestly assistants. Because we have to remember, we alluded to this morning, when we get to chapter 18 and we start getting into the law and other requirements, priests are going to be a huge part of that. And so this genealogy helps to establish who could serve as a priest and who could serve as a priestly assistant. When it begins, this genealogy actually looks like it's going to be a genealogy of all of Jacob's sons. Look at just the first few verses here. Verse 14, we'll go through 16. Chapter 6, verses 14 through 16. These are the heads of their fathers' households, the sons of Reuben, Israel's firstborn, Hanok and Palu, Hezron and Camri. These are the families of Reuben. The sons of Simeon, Jamal, Jamin, and Ohad, and Jachin, and Zohar, and Shaul, the son of the Canaanite woman. These are the families of Simeon. These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations: Gershom and Kohath and Merari. And the length of Levi's life was 137 years. I'm just going to stop there for a second. So you see, basically, it starts with Israel at the top, Jacob, and then the next three names we see, really Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. And so it appears from the beginning of this that he's just going to tell us about all the sons of Jacob, but you notice he stops after Levi. He doesn't do all 12 sons of Jacob. Instead of continuing on with the fourth son, he then goes on and he starts to follow down the line through Levi, which tells us that this isn't so much a genealogy of Jacob, it's a genealogy of who? Levi. In fact, we see that consistently throughout the text. If we look at verse 16, it says, "These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generations." Then you get down into verse 19. "These are the families of the Levites according to their generations." You go down to verse 25. "These are the heads of the fathers' households of the Levites according to their families." And so really, this is a genealogy of Levi, not all of Jacob's sons. That gives us our first clue as to why Moses included this in this particular location here. So it's really a genealogy about the sons of Levi. And what's important about the sons of Levi? What do we know about the sons of Levi that's different from all of the other sons of Jacob? That's where the priestly line comes from. And so that gives us our first clue. You'll notice that when we get to the fourth generation, the genealogy narrows even further. If you look at the purple on the bottom, that's the fourth generation. And so it's interesting how this plays out, because it starts with the first son of Jacob, gets to the third, then follows that third son, Levi's line down, and it goes to Amram, Ishhar, two other sons. But then you notice that it only sort of does children of three of those, not Hebron himself. But then only two of them, Amram and Ishhar, follows below that. And then you get all the way over to Aaron, and Aaron goes two more generations, which tells us again there's something significant about those particular individuals and why they're there. And that's what we're going to try to ferret out today. This is not a complete genealogy of all of the descendants of Jacob up until the Exodus. There's something to this pattern of why Moses kind of goes across, stops, then goes down that person's line, and then sort of only goes off certain parts of that, and then continues to go down and kind of, again, comes down through Aaron here. So Aaron's line continues on for an additional two generations. His son, one son, and then one grandson, and that'll be important. And then you'll notice this other individual, Korah. And we see three of Korah's sons. And again, that's going to be important as well, why he's included and why the others are not. So let's go ahead and kind of keep working through that. The focus of this genealogy, obviously, is Levi, Aaron, and Korah. Those three individuals. They become the focus of this. Levi and Aaron are important because God chose them for specific roles and responsibilities in Israel. Now, if you remember, he chose Aaron's sons, and their descendants for very specific role, and only their descendants for that particular role. Anybody remember what that role was? Aaron and Aaron's descendants? Priests. Yeah. Turn to Numbers chapter 3. Numbers chapter 3, first 4 verses. Now these are the records of the generations of Aaron and Moses at the time when the Lord spoke with Moses on Mount Sinai. These then are the names of the sons of Aaron: Nadab, the firstborn, Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithamar. These are the names of the sons of Aaron, the appointed priests whom he ordained to serve as priests. But Nadab and Abihu died before the Lord when they offered strange fire before the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai, and they had no children. So Eleazar and Ithamar served as priests in the lifetime of their father Aaron. So what we find here in Numbers chapter 3 is it tells us that Aaron and Aaron's descendants, we see them listed here, will ultimately be allowed to become priests. Now the priests were the ones who would basically be able to go into the Holy of Holies, for instance. They could offer certain sacrifices before the Lord, but they didn't perform all of the priestly duties, if you will. There are some assistants for that. But what we kind of see in Numbers here is that only certain individuals from Aaron's line are able to serve as priests, and if others tried to perform those same duties, God was not happy. They lost their lives. And so Aaron becomes extremely important because it's through him that the Lord basically develops the priesthood, those that could offer things like the sacrifice of atonement and other things. So this genealogy begins to serve for the Israelites as they go into the land. Well, who can serve as priests once we get in the land? And they could turn to this genealogy and see the lineage of who basically is a descendant of Aaron, and again goes down into the 6th generation here with Phinehas. Make sense? All right. God chose the descendants of Levi, not just Aaron, however, to serve as assistants to the priests. So turn to Numbers 3 again. Look at verses 5 through 10. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Bring the tribe of Levi near, and set them before Aaron the priest, that they may serve him. They shall perform the duties for him and the whole congregation before the tent of meeting to do the service of the tabernacle. They shall also keep the furnishings of the tent of meeting, along with the duties of the sons of Israel, to do the service of the tabernacle. You shall thus give the Levites to Aaron and to his sons. They are wholly given to him from among the sons of Israel. So you shall appoint Aaron and his sons that they may keep their priesthood, but the layman who serves shall be put to death." Again, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Now behold, I have taken the Levites from among the sons of Israel. Instead of every firstborn, the first issue of the womb from the sons of Israel, so the Levites shall be mine." So in essence, what we basically find the Lord saying here is, you've got Aaron, and some of his descendants can actually serve as priests. The other Levites can serve as assistants to the priest. And their responsibility is primarily the tabernacle. They can't perform the sacrifices that the priest can, but they can serve in the tabernacle. They can do other offerings and other sacrifices, but there are certain ones that were restricted only to the priests. And so you basically get these two distinct groups. You get the priests and you get the Levites. And they have certain duties. In fact, elsewhere in the scriptures it lays out even the different groups, the different families within the tribe of Levi have different responsibilities in the tabernacle. God just lays it all out. This group of Levites does this group of Levites does this group of Levites does this, and that would then follow down through their generations. Their job descriptions were already laid out. So if you knew you were a particular lineage within the tribe of Levi, you knew what your responsibilities would be at the temple or the tabernacle. And so that's essentially what we begin to see with this. Now, what's interesting about this is that sort of explains to us why the Lord put Aaron in there. And if you notice, Nahshon doesn't list any kids for Nahshon. Elisheba doesn't list any kids for Elisheba. Doesn't even list Moses' kids. But does tell us Aaron's line. Why? Because that's going to be important going into the land. They need to know who descended from Aaron. And they can see, well, Eleazar first and then his son Phinehas. They can begin to see. So now when it comes to getting into the land and saying, okay, we got to assign some priests, they can start here and say, wait a minute, no, you're a descendant of Nahshon. You can't be a priest. Oh, you're a descendant of Moses. You can't be a priest. But because you are a descendant of Levi, you can do these other duties within the temple. So it kind of lays that out for us. That's one of the purposes of this. But what this doesn't explain is why Korah is listed there and why Korah's descendants are shared with us. Why would that be the case? Because he doesn't do that with others. Why? Because the others aren't as important, right? We don't really need to know who the descendants are of Jachid up there off of Simeon. Because they don't have any special duties when it comes to the priesthood or the temple. So when we kind of look at this, we can sort of see who's important, especially with the line of the priests and ultimately tabernacle care. So why would he include Korah's descendants here? Why does he sort of highlight Korah? You know, we see Uzziel there. We see his names, but again, we don't really see much. We can't see in the scriptures what that's for. But there is a reason why Korah here might actually be mentioned. Anybody know what that reason might be? Does anybody know the name Korah? Yeah, Korah's rebellion. And I think that's why Moses gives us some additional information about Korah and Korah's descendants. If you notice, 6 of Moses' and Aaron's cousins are included in this genealogy. They're the ones that are basically, so Nashon, Elsheba, we've got Korah, Nepheg, and Zikri. Those are their cousins. Okay? Their names are all given, but the only ones that we see with descendants are Aaron and Korah. So there's something important about Aaron's descendants and something important about Korah's descendants, because they're highlighted for us. The other thing that's interesting is that if you go back to the text, Korah's descendants here are stuck in the middle of Aaron's, which is kind of weird. In other words, he starts Aaron's descendants, then goes to Korah and comes back to Aaron. Look at verses 24. Exodus chapter 3 again. Or I'm sorry, Exodus 6. If you look at verse 24, 23. He starts Aaron's genealogy. Aaron married Elsheba, the daughter of Amminadab, the sister of Nashon, and she bore him Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar, and Ithmar. So he starts the list of Aaron's genealogy, but then all of a sudden he goes to Korah. The sons of Korah, Asher and Elkanah, and Abisaph. These are the families of Korah, of the Korahites. Then he goes back to Aaron. Aaron's sons, Eleazar, married one of the daughters of... So he sticks Korah sort of... He's talking about Aaron, but he splits it and he sticks Korah sort of in there, and then goes back to Aaron's genealogies. Again, a clue. There's something going on with Korah here. And what is that? It's, I believe, what you guys have already shared, Korah's rebellion. It's recorded in Numbers chapter 16. And the fact was, Korah was not qualified to serve as a priest, but thought he should. He thought he ought to lead. Numbers chapter 16, basically what happens is Korah, he was a Levite. He's supposed to serve in the temple. He's supposed to care for that. But he wasn't happy about having that role. He wanted to usurp Moses and Aaron's role, so he gathered 250 other Levites, leaders from other tribes, and he tries to usurp Moses' authority. In fact, in Numbers 16, verse 3, he actually says, "You have gone far enough," talking to Moses, "for all the congregation are holy." Every one of us is holy. And the Lord is in their midst. He's among all of us. So why do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord? In other words, what gives you the right, Moses? We're all holy. We're all equal. We're all Levites. We should be able to do what you're doing. What right do you have to do what you're doing? Making yourself better than us, more important than us. That's essentially what Korah was doing. As a result, Moses actually rebukes him. Turn to Numbers chapter 16. We'll see this pretty clearly in Numbers 16. Numbers chapter 16, verse 8. Then Moses said to Korah, "Hear now, you sons of Levi." These are these 250 Levites, leaders that have come to confront Moses. "Is it not enough for you that the God of Israel has separated you from the rest of the congregation of Israel, to bring you near to himself, to do the service of the tabernacle of the Lord, and to stand before the congregation to minister to them? And that he has brought you near, Korah, and all your brothers, sons of Levi, with you?" Notice what he's saying there. He's like, aren't you satisfied with what God has given to you? Think about this. You're special. You're dedicated to him. He selected you and your brothers to serve before him in the temple. That's not something everybody gets to do. This is an honor. God has chosen you for this. But you're not satisfied with it? Instead, look at what he says. "Therefore," verse 11, end of verse 10, "are you seeking for the priesthood also?" That was something, again, reserved for Aaron and his descendants. "Therefore, you and all your company are gathered together against the Lord, but as for Aaron, who is he that you grumble against him?" So in essence, what Moses is saying is, you're not satisfied with what the Lord has given you as a responsibility? You think too lightly of it? That you now somehow have to usurp the authority of the priests, something that was specifically reserved and given to Aaron? You're going to grumble against him, but notice he says you're grumbling against the Lord. So one of the reasons I believe why we have Korah listed here in this particular genealogy is in some respects sort of a negative thing. What they could do here was they could look at this genealogy and they could say, who's qualified to be a priest? But they could also say, who's not qualified to be a priest? And oh, by the way, if you're a descendant of Korah, any one of his sons, this means you. So it wasn't just about who's qualified to serve as a priest, but Moses is bringing up something that they would be reminded of, much like you guys. Any Hebrew would have remembered and understood the rebellion of Korah because God sucks them into the ground. They were put to death, all 250 of them. Why? Because they tried to usurp God's authority, or Aaron's authority, something that God had specifically given to them. So one of the things that this genealogy will do is it tells us who can qualify to serve as a priest under Aaron, who qualifies as a Levite to serve in the temple, but also who can't serve. And it's a reminder of what happens to those who try to usurp that. Those like Korah and Korah's rebellion. So the primary purpose, or one of the primary purposes of this genealogy, is a way to determine who could serve as priests and what we call priestly assistants for God. And that's critical. What might we have for a takeaway from that? God is serious about those who are qualified to serve and lead his people. There's no question about it. We see that in the New Testament, don't we? He tells us who can be qualified to serve as a pastor, as an elder, a deacon. And he's serious about it. The way that we are supposed to handle those who are in positions of, say, leadership within the church and serving and aren't really qualified, or their behavior doesn't line up. In fact, the Bible tells us to call them out publicly. You get an elder caught in sin who no longer is qualified to serve, or a pastor who's not qualified to serve because of some sinful behavior or false teaching. And it says that they're to be confronted publicly, because God is serious about those who are qualified to serve, especially in positions of leadership. And we see that here with this. He will take his priesthood seriously. In fact, one of the things that the high priest would do before they went into the Holy of Holies, anybody know what they would do? When the priest would go into the Holy of Holies, they tied a rope to their feet. Why? Just in case they died. It could pull them out because nobody's going to go back in and get them. They understood God takes leadership seriously, and so that's one of the purposes of this genealogy. How about a second purpose? The second purpose of this genealogy was to confirm the fulfillment of God's promises to Abraham. Now, this is an interesting one. Back in Genesis chapter 15, God revealed to Abraham that his descendants would not only spend 400 years in the foreign land, but that he would bring them out, it says, in the fourth generation. Well, that's kind of interesting. This genealogy reveals that God did exactly that. If you look at this, you're going to see that the first generation was Israel with his sons, Reuben, Simeon, Levi. The second generation then is that below them. Then we get the third generation. And then in the very bottom we get the fourth generation, which starts with Moses, Aaron, Korah. And who was it that led Israel out of the land of Egypt? It's the fourth generation. Now, there are additional generations in this, meaning we have Aaron, but that's the way generations work, right? Meaning, I got married later in life, and so at one point, it was basically my mom and dad, and then me and my siblings. And we didn't have any kids, so we were, the end of that, say, second generation. But my sister already had kids. Well, now she's in the third generation, but they lived at the same time I did. And that's kind of what we see here. But the point of this is, one of the reasons why the genealogy is structured like this is because God is revealing that he did exactly what he said he would do. He would take Israel out in the fourth generation. And Moses and Aaron are ultimately the fourth generation from Jacob. And they were the ones that led them out. Now, it doesn't mean that there weren't other generations below them. And we could see probably, we don't know how many kids Molly had. He could have had kids, and they could have already had kids, and so there may be other generations. But overall, when you get to Moses and Aaron, we've got 4 generations, and they were the ones that ultimately led Israel out. That was the generation of adults that left the land of Egypt. So God did exactly what he said he would do. Lead them out in the 4th generation. Now, just with genealogies in general, there's always some kind of controversy when it comes to these genealogies, and there's clearly controversies with this one. One of them is that people claim that 4 generations from Jacob to Aaron just isn't enough generations to cover 430 years. And, you look at it and you kind of go, maybe. But what's interesting is they actually list the ages here. You can see 137 years for Levi. Amram was 137 years. We know Moses was 80 at this time when he was getting ready to lead them out. What people will often do with this here, because they say, man, 4 generations isn't enough to cover 430 years, is they'll shrink the timetable. And so we did this initially when we started this study. We said, well, general consensus is they were either in the land for 430 years or they were in the land for 215. Part of the reason why some believe only 200 and some odd years is because, that's more appropriate for the number of generations. The problem with that is there are other passages, Genesis 15, Exodus 12, Galatians 3, that suggest, no, this is right. It was 4 generations. Plus, it is technically possible when you start adding up ages, and if birth is at the very end of their older lives, technically you could cover 400 plus years in 4 generations. So it's possible, maybe not probable, but again, it's what we have here, and we're going to trust that what we see here is the truth, right? Even if we can't always put the pieces together. Other claims are that Israel could not have grown from 70 individuals to what we suspect is maybe 2 million people in just 4 generations. I've played around with this. I punched it into a number of different AI engines, and actually it's quite possible. You can get from 70 people to 2 million in 4 generations. Especially if there are other intermingled generations within there. Remember I said with this, we've got 4 generations really laid out here when we get to Aaron and Moses. There's 2 more generations below them under Eleazar and Phinehas. But we don't know how many other generations there are with some of the other kids. Like I said, we could have had somebody like Hebron could have had 3 generations under him at this point if they all get married early and have kids early. So there might be from Israel to Levi down to Amram, down to maybe other. We could have other generations stuck in there. Does that make sense? And we don't know how many kids they had. And the other thing we don't understand is how fruitful was Israel? We are told in the beginning of the book of Exodus that they were really, really fruitful. This is not a list of every single descendant within these lines. They stop off. They don't tell us who some of the kids were, other generations in there. So it becomes really difficult when you look at something like this, to know exactly how many generations are crammed within here. In other words, you've got the 4 primary generations. How many other generations are crammed within there? And how many kids did they have? And how fruitful were they? We have to just remember God's work with Israel. He made them fruitful and multiplied them. And so getting from 70 individuals to 2 million in quote, 4 generations is not impossible. Very probable. Within 400 years, it's absolutely possible to do that. Others will claim there's gaps in this genealogy and you can stick things in there, but again, we can go to other passages like Numbers chapter 3, Numbers 26, 1 Chronicles chapter 6, and there are no gaps in this genealogy. There are no gaps between Jacob, Levi, Kohath, Amram, and Aaron. There are no gaps in there. But others will say, no, there has to be gaps in there, and they try to stick people in there. But we can turn to other genealogies and show, nope, there's no gaps. So, it gets a little muddy. I think one of the problems we face with something like this is we get caught up in all the nitpicky details. Well, how in the world can we get 2 million people in 400 years and in 4 generations? And there's got to be gaps in here, because this doesn't really make sense. You add up the numbers, and we forget the main point is, Moses is trying to tell us, God did what he said he would do and did it in 4 generations. That's the main point. And we can get caught up in all the minor details and trying to figure out how it all works, but that's going down the rabbit hole and we miss the point. The point is Moses is trying to tell us here in this genealogy, God did what he told Abraham he would do. He was faithful to his promise. He said he would take him out in 4 generations, and he did exactly that. He is a faithful, good, trustworthy God. He does exactly what he said he would do. And this genealogy shows that. That's why I like this. I messed around with this because the original diagram of the genealogies was set up by the individual you see in the corner there, a guy by the name of Byron Merowaki, I think his last name was. I just popped this into a couple of AI engines and said, make it more of a pretty graphic. And that added the colors to show the generations, because the first diagram I had, it was hard to see the generations. But this does a good job of that. It lays out for us that, no, it was indeed 4 generations. And so that's, I think, the takeaway. And what does that mean for us? Again, we come back to this all the time. God is a God who fulfills his promises. And sometimes it's a little tricky to see that, because we struggle with a little bit like, how does this exactly fit? And, how do the ears line up? But that's more because it's just difficult for us. Sometimes we don't have maybe all the information we need. But the big picture is God does exactly what he says he's going to do. And he did it in 4 generations, just like he said he would do. And that's good enough for me. The last thing I want to see here is the third purpose. And it's that this genealogy establishes Moses and Aaron's authority to lead people out. And again, this is partly based in controversy. Immediately following the genealogy, there's this 2-verse addendum that Moses kind of sticks in here. And it uses some repetition, some 3-fold repetition regarding Moses and Aaron. I want you to look at this. Look at verses 26 and 27. It says, it was the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring out the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their hosts. They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt, about bringing out the sons of Israel from Egypt. It was the same Moses and Aaron. Now it came about, well, we'll leave that for next week, but you notice there's a couple of things that happened there. One is it says it was the same Aaron and Moses to whom Yahweh said. Other translations say it was this Aaron and Moses. Then it goes on and says, they were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh. Then it goes on and says, it was the same Moses and Aaron. You think something's being stressed here? Who was it that brought them out? The same Aaron and Moses. Not just Aaron and Moses. The word same is inserted there, but the Hebrew suggests that it's stressing. No, this Moses. The Moses we've seen up to this point, this is the Moses that brought you out. This is the Moses and Aaron that confronted Pharaoh. And why might that actually be important? One of the commentaries that I have at home on Exodus is by a man named Douglas Stewart. What he wrote about this particular statement here is this. This emphasis, meaning this little addendum that Moses added, unmistakably links Moses and Aaron to not only the genealogy, but to the Exodus itself. And so I want to look at that just real quickly here. Again, the statement links Moses and Aaron specifically to the genealogy, but also specifically to the event of the Exodus. And you may say, well, why would that be important? We know Moses did that, right? Well, let's look at that first part, connecting Moses to this genealogy. Why would it be really important to connect Moses to this genealogy? Moses is in this genealogy, but nothing's expanded upon him. Aaron is a part of this genealogy and is expanded, right? We know why. But why is that important to stick Moses right in the line of Jacob and ultimately Levi? Well, it proved Moses' Hebrew ancestry, and that's going to be really important. It may not have been too much of a problem for Aaron because Aaron stayed in Egypt. The Egyptians or the Israelites knew who he was. They probably knew his parents and everything else. But think about Moses for a second. Moses was raised and lived in the palace probably as an Egyptian. Most of them would not have known a time when Moses was born, probably. So he spent the first 40 years of his life living as an Egyptian in the palace. New Testament tells us skilled in all the ways and the knowledge of the Egyptians. Then, when he fled, he went to Midian for 40 years, and he spent 40 years living outside of Egypt, and he married a Midianite woman, and therefore had children who were of a Midianite heritage. And all of a sudden, he shows back up as an 80-year-old in Egypt. Do you think that the Egyptians might question, who are you? The other thing we might add to this is, if Moses was the individual that many think that he was, named Senenmut in Egypt, he was a high-ranking Egyptian official, that might be what they remember of him. It's unlikely they would be thinking of him necessarily as a Hebrew, especially when they start to get into some challenges. You know, there's a couple of passages we'll get to in the future here where things don't exactly go the way they're supposed to, and they question. There's a time where they confront Moses. We see Korah confronting Moses. So it's important to link Moses to this genealogy to say Moses is a descendant of Jacob. He's a Hebrew. He's just like you are. And this genealogy would put to doubt any thought that Moses was Egyptian and not Hebrew. The other thing that, according to what Douglas Stewart suggests here, and I think he's probably right, it unmistakably links Moses to the Exodus as the authority figure for leading them out of Egypt. If you think about it, in Numbers chapter 16, not everybody recognized Moses and Aaron's authority. Korah didn't think that Moses should have been leaving him. He figured he could do a better job, as could all the other 250 Levites that he gathered around him. But one of the things Moses said to them, this is back in Numbers chapter 16, verse 28, when he's confronting Korah and his family for what they're doing. God had sucked up Korah and his family into a giant hole in the ground, sent fire down from heaven, consumed all 250 leaders. In essence saying, no, Moses is my guy. You're not. But before that happened, Moses actually said to Korah, by this you shall know that Yahweh has sent me to do all these deeds. For this is not from my heart. We know Moses didn't want to lead Israel out of Egypt. That was the last thing he wanted to do. He not only gave the 5 objections that we saw, but on one other occasion he says twice, Lord, I can't do this, essentially. Got discouraged after he confronted Pharaoh and it didn't work out the way that he wanted it to work out. Moses did not take this task upon his own shoulders. And so when Moses says in verses 26 and 27, because Moses is writing this, it's the same Aaron and Moses to whom the Lord said, bring out the sons of Israel from the land of Egypt according to their hosts. They were the ones who spoke to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. It was the same Moses, the same Aaron. Moses added that as an addendum here after the rebellion of Korah. We know that because that's when he wrote the book. Do you think Moses in his mind is thinking, I'm going to add something here so they understand? That the same guy that is writing this, the same guy that, because he wrote this while he was in the wilderness with them. In essence, Moses, I think, is putting this here, tying it back to the genealogy to say, I'm a Hebrew. God put me in this position. I didn't choose this for myself. He's the reason I have the authority, along with Aaron, to lead you. It's not of my own making. It's not of my own choosing. God has done it, and that's what I've been able to demonstrate through this. And so I think that's partly why he stuck himself in at the very end here with this little addendum. It's to establish, I have the right to lead God's people, not because I chose it for myself, but because God established it. God put me here. And we can see how he went kicking and screaming, dragging his feet. I think, as I think about just maybe the takeaway for something like that, it's a little muddy for us sometimes, but ultimately God is the one who selects his leaders. It really is. Even when it comes to the church. And again, it gets a little muddy because, we get somebody that says, I think I want to be a pastor. And so we go to seminary, and we get our degree and our letters after our name, and we go out and we maybe candidate for a church or whatever. And that can kind of look like that individual is chosen to do that. And I don't want to downplay that at all. But if you really get down to it, if you come down to, really seeing what's going on, God is the one that selects who it is that's going to lead. And that's where the authority comes from. I have no authority. I really don't. Unfortunately, we have many within the church who think otherwise. I've been paying attention recently to a lot of what's been going on with Bethel and Hillsong and some of the other things with what many are referring to as cover-up culture, with these prophets, so-called prophets and teachers and that, who are doing some ungodly things. Fake prophecies, using social media to gather information about people and then stand up and make prophecies and pretending that they're speaking on God's behalf. And many are involved with all kinds of sexual, disgusting behavior. And yet they're put right back up in places of leadership because they're apostles and they're leaders and they're grabbing at straws. And, I'm going to name a name here, but, I mentioned Mark Driscoll earlier today about this whole rededicating 250 thing. Well, Mark Driscoll happened to pastor a church out in Seattle called Mars Hill. Was ultimately kicked out of the church because of his abusive behavior, and it's extremely well documented in emails and over 40 individuals that had worked with him that called for his ouster. And he basically packs his bags, he moves down to Texas and starts another church. And now the same behavior is happening at this new church with the same leadership guys that put him in the first church. He's not qualified to be there, but he grasps it and thinks that he is. And again, I don't want to rant here, but the reality of it is, authority comes from God, not from somebody who just chooses it. And that's why God has the high standards that he does and lays out in Scripture what's required. And we kind of see all of that here. We see him saying, here's who can qualify as a priest and as a priestly assistant. It has to be somebody within this line. But also Moses saying, I didn't choose this for myself. God put me in this position. And that's where I think, even today we have to be a little careful. Do I believe God has put me here for a reason? Yes, I do. But it's not maybe like Aaron and Moses to the same degree. But we have to take that very seriously. And pastors and elders are given a certain amount of authority, and we're told to respect them, are we not? The Bible does tell us to respect the elders within the church. But it also gives us a qualification of that. So we have to be a little bit careful, but I think my takeaway from this is when I see Moses here, and I see Moses' heart, and sort of putting himself in this passage here and reminding him at the very end that this same Moses is the one that is leading you. It's the one that you see recorded here, the one that you see God has placed here. That's where my authority comes from. I didn't choose this. God chose me. And that, makes me think about Dustin's role and my role here. We're not here because we necessarily chose this. He didn't choose it. I begged him to come along. But I believe God has placed me here, but I'm going to be very careful in trying to grab the same authority Moses did, but at the same token, I recognize that God has placed me where He has placed me, and I'm hoping and praying that I don't screw it up sometimes. But, well, I hope that when we look at the genealogies, that maybe we can not just skip over them. Again, as we look at this genealogy today, we can see why Moses actually put it here. It helps to identify who can serve, especially when they come into the land as priests and as priestly assistants. It tells us that God actually fulfilled His promise in bringing the Israelites out of Egypt in the 4th generation, but it also helps to establish why Moses and Aaron had the authority to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. It wasn't Moses' own choice, it was God's choice to do it. And it was the same exact Moses that they could hear the stories about. And as future generations would read this, they would know this is the Moses and Aaron that God selected and chose to bring us out of Egypt. Amen?